It's hard to imagine now, but Scary Movie was once the spoof movie franchise of the early 2000s. Not only was it a huge financial success, it launched the next big chapter in American parody cinema, cementing the creative trio of the Wayan brothers as a part of the same comedic group as Charlie Chaplin, Abbott and Costello, Mel Brooks, and David Zucker. The popularity of Scary Movie might have had more to do with its particular brand of crude humor being as low as a brow can possibly get, rather than how well it parodied popular horror films of the time. Although, to parody something, there has to be some amount of analyzing and critiquing of what's being parodied. In other words, despite how mindless they may seem, the Scary Movie films do say something about the horror film genre, and I'm going to try to figure out what that is. Why? Because they made me. The first film released in the year 2000 and borrowed both the general plot and working title from the 1996 horror classic, Scream. In short, a group of 30-year-old high school students in small-town America end up being targeted and murdered by the model from a Norwegian proto-expressionist painting. It's pretty basic stuff as far as teen slashers go. What makes it interesting that Scary Movie borrows its story from Scream was that the latter was already an attempt at a deconstruction of this particular subgenre. With Scary Movie, there were suddenly two films which approached the same narrative from opposite sides of a sort of deconstructivist spectrum. One attempts to openly comment on horror films, while the other attempts to ridicule them. As I grew older, I started thinking that surely this made Scary Movie somewhat redundant. Or maybe even that Scary Movie made Scream redundant. There are important distinctions that sets them apart though. Time to bring out the fire extinguishers because here comes the hot takes! Whenever the first Scary Movie attempts to say something concrete about the horror genre or tropes in general, I genuinely think it hits harder than when Scream tries it. Perhaps most of all in the way it subtextually brings up feminism. One of the most iconic scenes of Scream is when Randy is delivering his speech about the rules of surviving a horror film. No copulation, no cold ones, and so on. It's a fair observation, specifically when applied to slasher films from the previous decades. The lone survivor tends to be a woman who previously never indulged in sex, drugs, or even the tiniest amount of rock and roll. So what does Scream do with this observation? Well, it gives us a scene where the main character does have sex, but survives the film anyway. That is technically a subversion of the final girl trope, and I guess it was somewhat of a novelty back in 1996, but it's not very loud as far as scathing critiques of the genre go. Ironic, given the film's name. Don't get me wrong, Scream is good. It has a solid enough point, and Sidney has always been a good and refreshing character in the slasher film canon. It's just hard to shake the feeling that Scream's whole shtick boils down to pointing at the TV and bragging about knowing all the tricks, rather than offering insight about why those tricks were used, or why they're worth pointing out in the first place. While Scream barely lingers on the act itself, choosing instead to focus on the juxtaposition of the party downstairs watching a more traditional horror film where Randy's rules do apply. Scary Movie uses its sex scene to properly develop its lead, Cindy. Specifically through the way the scene, well, climaxes. Her enjoyment is primarily played for laughs. Like, isn't it funny how an archetypical virgin like her is so dominant in bed? Although what makes the scene interesting is how it makes the moment about Cindy's pleasure without sexualizing her. It's more about liberation than eroticism. Cindy is finally comfortable enough to let her guard down and allow her boyfriend Bobby to witness her in her full goblin mode. The camera, meanwhile, isn't aimed to please a horny male gaze, like it normally would in a teen slasher film. It respectfully enough, draws your attention to what the characters are feeling about the situation, what they have to say about it. It's not a perfect representation of consensual sex. Bobby is way too forceful about Cindy going down on him, and later Cindy suddenly starts slapping Bobby across the face without warning. Not to mention that there is a sense of infantilization in regards to Cindy's sexual knowledge. But the way the scene ends, how Cindy learns to be herself and how their lovemaking literally shakes the whole house, is a promotion of women's pleasure I definitely wouldn't expect from a Scary Movie era spoof. Two of my favorite scenes in the film revolve around the character of Buffy. This one, not that one. Now, my interpretation of this first one is admittedly a stretch, especially considering the benefit of hindsight. But if we do like old Roland Barthes and unalive the authors for a moment, I think there's an intriguing observation to be made here. During a beauty pageant, Buffy is applauded for her dramatic acting as she screams and cries to the audience that her boyfriend is being murdered on the balcony behind them. Which he actually is. This is one of the film's genuinely good gags, for multiple reasons. All too often, we equate the best actors and the best acting with overly dramatic monologues.
Every day I wake up!
I once randomly stumbled upon a YouTube clip summarizing all the Oscar winners for best male and female actors between the year 2000 and somewhere around 2017. Almost every clip shown was of someone being sad, angry, or both. We're kind of fixated on these emotions, to the point that it seems to be difficult to focus on equally important parts of the human experience. It almost seems like what's being said doesn't actually matter, as long as it's said with feeling. A sad feeling, preferably. More to the point though, the scene can also be read as a declaration about how specifically women aren't properly listened to, even when they're screaming their lungs out. Rather than turning around and seeing the horrible thing Buffy is experiencing, the audience chooses comfortable ignorance and praises Buffy for speaking out, but ultimately doesn't take her seriously. In this sense, it's not Buffy who's being performative. It's the audience. What makes this scene even more intriguing in retrospect is that the film was produced by Dimension Films, a Weinstein company. Harvey Weinstein actually did go to jail for his multiple sex crimes towards women, but based on all of the other cases of men in Hollywood who did get exposed but ultimately got away with it, he was merely used as a sacrificial symbol for the Me Too movement. Weinstein is now a name synonymous with sex crimes, and with the Me Too movement. But there is a sort of performative aspect to his sentence. He was just one person, after all. Sure, him being jailed likely gave a lot of people a sense of catharsis, but so many other men who allegedly have done similar or maybe even worse things are still allowed to work within Hollywood today. Weinstein was a scapegoat, and now Hollywood is acting like the sacrifice of this particular goat was enough. Like the killer in Scary Movie, many real-life villains are able to get away with their crimes, even when they're called out. In the second scene, Buffy is being confronted by the killer in the school locker room. During my rewatch of this film, this was the moment where Buffy became one of my favorite horror film characters of all time. And that's saying something considering that Brenda is also in this film. This scene perfectly represents every single woman who's ever been told by a male director to scream her lungs out in front of a camera. And frankly, she is so fucking sick of it. She even goes so far that she deliberately breaks her own leg to play along with the charade. And when the killer finally decapitates her, she keeps ranting. The statement here, whether it was intentional or not, is both loud and clear. No matter how tiring the idea of the completely helpless female character in a horror film is, it simply refuses to die. Put it in the trash where it belongs. Scary Movie tackles this issue by ultimately doing the exact thing it's critiquing, which is a reoccurring problem throughout this franchise. But in this case, it does it with so much jadedness that you can really feel how tired this trope actually is. It condenses literal decades of poor representation of women on film into a single scene. The scene also mirrors the experience of playing as a survivor in Dead by Daylight. I swear this is the last time I'm gonna mention this game. 2 whole videos were more than enough. I wish I had similar praise regarding how queer people were depicted in the film. No luck there, unfortunately. These previous examples might make Scary Movie come off as a somewhat decent feminist text, but they are admittedly cherry-picked. They do not represent the film as a whole, which becomes all too clear when we take a closer look at the characters of Ray and Miss Man. Well, Miss Man isn't as much a character as a deliberately offensive caricature of a trans person. The personification of the transgender boogeyman modern-day conservatives want you to believe are lurking around in our public bathrooms. Out of all the characters in Scary Movie, Miss Man has no jokes to offer, because she is the joke. If the name wasn't enough of a clue, her role in the film concludes with the reveal of a ball sack dangling suspiciously low from under her skirt. If the Rocky Horror Picture Show was able to give queer people respectful representation back in 1975, there's just no excusing Scary Movie for being a product of its time. You're clearly supposed to be disgusted by this character. Not just by the way they look, but how she creepily takes advantage of her position as an authority figure at Cindy's school, being a female-presenting PE teacher with open access to the girls' locker room. Watching this scene in a time where politicians have openly declared war on transgenderism is gut-wrenchingly awful. Because this is the exact type of crap that fuels such misguided resentment towards trans people. Ray is a slightly more complicated character to dissect. Unlike Miss Man, he definitely has jokes. It's just that it's the same joke. Over and over again. Ray is gay, you see. Or is he? Throughout the film, he takes every opportunity he gets to allude to his closeted sexuality. Scary Movie isn't remotely interested in subtlety, so it's more that he's closeted around his oblivious friends rather than the audience. There is a fairly optimistic way of interpreting this character. He is refreshingly confident with airing his attraction to other men, and you could even make the argument that he's an homage to characters like Jesse from A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, a character who not only exuded heavy amounts of subliminal queerness, but who was played by gay actor Mark Patton. Rather than doing a character who the audience can clearly read as gay, even when the film refuses to do so, like in the second Elm Street film.
Something is trying to get inside my body.
Yeah, and she's female and she's waiting for you in the cabana. And you want to sleep with me.
Scary Movie makes Ray so gay that it becomes a joke how none of the other characters can see it. But then at the end, it turns out that he isn't gay after all. Or at least he refuses to admit it. And then he dies, as he suggestively embraces Bobby from behind. What bugs me about Ray is that, while you can put a positive spin on his inclusion in the film, I also get the feeling that the audience is simply supposed to laugh at him. The first time Ray dies, because death doesn't mean anything in this franchise, we watch him enjoy himself as someone is poking him with their meat through a glory hole. Just like in the scene with Miss Man, there is clearly a cis-normative and heterosexual observer in mind. And their mind is meant to be filled with disgust. There is comedy in the disgusting, for those who enjoy that kind of thing. But this is just blatant homophobia. There is one other aspect of Scary Movie that I failed to mention up until now, and it's not without its reason. If you couldn't tell already, I'm white. In fact, in this context, I'm embarrassingly white. I didn't give rap music a proper chance until I was in my early 20s. The closest I'd ever gotten to the genre before that was the occasional Mike Shinoda bars on my pirated Linkin Park albums, some Gorillaz singles, and Fred fucking Durst. I didn't fully start exploring black horror cinema until Get Out made me realize what I had been missing out on. It is really not my place to talk about the blackness of Scary Movie. But this aspect is such an integral part of the franchise that it would be too large of an omission not to talk about it. Thankfully, fellow video essayist and connoisseur of early 2000s parody films Yhara Zayd was willing to give her thoughts on this topic.
While the early days of horror and film weren't particularly inviting to black people have always invited horror, even if Hollywood has consistently thought otherwise. Writer Tracy Oliver has an interesting and infuriating anecdote about this. I'd already said, prior to Get Out coming out, when people would ask what I'd want to do next, this sounds random because people don't think of black women and horror, but I was like, I want to do a horror movie. And not only do I want to do a horror movie, but I want it to be with black women. So people were like, that's an interesting combination. One of the execs who passed on it, his issue with it was, do black women watch horror movies? He was just like, I don't think that happens. We're used to the trope by now. The black character is the first to die. And there's actually a lot to unpack there because statistically that's not completely valid, but another topic for another day. In horror's nascence, though, this trope was never the case because black people simply didn't exist in these movies. But when they did start to exist in the center, one thing kept popping up over and over. These characters either had no depth, very few lines, existed solely as caricatures, or they died first. But let's be honest, 9 times out of 10, it was some monstrous combination of the four. Like, I know Jackie in Slumber Party Massacre must have spoken at least once, but I can't for the life of me off the top of my head think of any one line she must have said because Most of her lines were throwaway lines that could have been said by anyone else. But the idea behind that decision sort of reads as she doesn't need distinctive characterization, because why waste that time and effort on a black character? Still madly in love with her though. In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, the trope of the black character dying first became even more frustrating because black characters in the 90s, specifically in movies with a predominantly white production, oozed of tokenism. We see the trope dissected and subverted with Scream 2, which opens with the deaths of two black characters played by Omar Epps and Jada Pinkett Smith. The trope is then further subverted by the character Hallie, played by Elise Neal, who not only survives longer than most other characters in the film, but who in the original script, allegedly, was meant to be revealed as one of the killers. I wish she could have been one of the killers. We've never had a black person be the killer in a Scream franchise, not yet. That's not a spoiler. But the real magic came with the first entry into what would become the Scary Movie franchise. Directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans and written by Sean and Marlon Wayans. Other writers credited on this are Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer, but seeing what their work post-Scary Movie looked like, I just can't bring myself to believe they wrote anything significant for the first movie. It's very easy to dismiss the Scary Movie franchise on the grounds of parody being derivative, and on the fact that after the monstrous financial success of the first movie, the follow-up movies became worse and worse, as ownership of the franchise was being slowly but steadily taken away from the Wayans brothers. It's kind of hilarious to look back on it and to watch the series in one straight consecutive marathon, because you can practically see the films slipping further and further out of the hands of the Wayans. I'm not here to argue that Scary Movie is actually deep and therefore needs to be respected. In fact, if there's anything you must know about me, it's that I'm a firm believer that art does not need to be elevated to be respected. Dumb shit is just as admirable as serious and meditative art house shit. But I do want to point out that the existence of Scary Movie was not just a satirization of horror tropes and cliches, but it was also an invitation to black people to exist in these worlds we were often shut out of, and an invitation to make us laugh at the uncomfortable truths surrounding horror and its dismissal of blackness. It walked the tightrope between commentary and comedy without ever being reliant on black pain or exploiting a narrative. What I love the most about black characters in these early entries into the series is that they never have to buckle or bend under the unbearable weight of existing as a symbol, or better yet, as a message. Too often black stories are only told because they are thought to serve as a message standing in the face of adversity. Too often black creatives get dismissed during pitch meetings because the mostly black world created for their television and film spec scripts are not seen as being necessary. What purpose does their blackness serve? Is this a movie about overcoming racism? Overcoming poverty? Overcoming the prison industrial complex? No? Okay, I don't think we really need that. In the Scary Movie franchise, these black characters just are. They get to be as ridiculous as everyone else without having the need to put on this facade of seriousness to get across any message. Scary Movie, and I cannot stress this enough, 1 and 2 did something more profound than posit the philosophy of black pain on the silver screen. It had the nerve to posit black joy in a small but impactful way. Another thing I love about the inception of this franchise was that death wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't permanent. Take the character Brenda Meeks, played hilariously by the ever-brilliant, ever-talented Regina Hall. Brenda is killed on screen twice, the first time being in the first installment of the series, but she's back for the sequel. She also gets killed in the third one and is back in the fourth one. The same goes for Ray and Shorty, who both get killed off in the first movie and return for another horror-esque adventure in the second one. It was also a way for black people to see characters doing what black audiences often said they would do if they found themselves in such a situation as the ones depicted in horror films. And that is simply to get the fuck out.
Reporting live for Black TV. White folks are dead, we're getting the fuck out of here. Let's roll, Jack. Come on, back to the let's go, motherfucker. Go, go.
I can't pretend that there aren't things in the franchise that I don't like, or there aren't things that have aged really poorly, because it's rife with them. There are so many jokes that make me uncomfortable, some that make me cringe, and others that I'll politely say have aged poorly, although I doubt they were ever that funny to begin with. At the same time, though, I have immense respect for this movie, and the fact that it just exists. For so long, the lovers of horror presented to us in the mainstream have been mostly white. Even the imagery associated with horror is mostly white. Pale skin, dark hair, Gosh, I just got a flashback of Stephenie Meyer shaking with rage that one of her characters was cast with a black actor because according to her, black people could not be pale. So it amazes me, even today, that the first proper parody of the horror genre in slasher films was made by 3 black people. I'm not amazed that the people who wrote the parody were black. Like I said, black people have always loved horror. I'm more amazed that a horror parody written by 3 black comedians was greenlit at all, and getting it picked up was no small feat. The anecdote Tracy Oliver talked about, the one I shared in the beginning, wasn't far off from how the Wayans were treated. Their pitch for Scary Movie was rejected multiple times on the basis of, well, do black people watch horror movies? I don't think that happens.
Check the fucking music room.
The plot of Scary Movie 2 takes place an unspecified amount of time after the so-called Stevenson County Massacre. The main characters from the first film return. Well, the ones whose actors wanted or were allowed to return anyway. This time around, they're asked by one of their college professors to spend a weekend at a haunted house, allowing the film to mainly poke fun at more classic and gothic horror films in the style of House of Haunted Hill. The events of the previous film are still canonical, despite the protagonist being very much alive again, which admittedly is pretty funny. I really want to stress here that the Wayans brothers are fully capable of writing successfully entertaining comedy. One of the main reasons why I wanted to make this analysis in the first place was because I stumbled upon a bunch of YouTube videos with the allegedly funniest parts of the franchise, believing that the films were perhaps way better than I'd ever given them credit for. Some of those bits are right here in Scary Movie 2.
The mad cow. Moo! Moo! Motherfucker! Moo!
What I realized was that it's when they're put into context that the humor starts to slightly fade. For those who have seen my video on horror having a, quote, ugliness problem, this part will traverse some familiar ground. Let's talk about the characters of Dwight and Hanson the Caretaker, played by David Cross and Chris Elliott respectively. Respectfully? No, it's not respectfully, that's completely the opposite. Played by David Cross and Chris Elliott respectively. Dwight has thin hair, glasses which obviously break, more than once, and he's in a wheelchair. He gets very defensive and angry whenever someone offers him help, resulting in such scenes as the one where he repeatedly attempts and fails to drag himself up a staircase, and the one where he, well, plays his own flute, so to speak. Everything about Dwight is deliberately designed to make the audience view him as pathetic. That's not me saying that he or anyone with similar features actually is, but it is the way Dwight is depicted and treated by other characters. Especially Hanson, who himself is a classically queer-coded villain with a congenital anomaly in his left hand. Hanson might be one of, if not the most iconic character of the Scary Movie franchise. He is also the worst. He is the worst because whenever you feel like the filmmakers have reached the very bottom with how little respect they seem to have for real-life people with similar congenital anomalies, they just keep digging. It's not just that the characters are so disgusted by Hanson's hand that they refuse to even touch the food he prepared for them. The audience is made to empathize with them when Hanson demolishes the dessert with it and completely covers the turkey with his own spit. The film counters any rational point about Hanson just having a hand that looks a little different by making the audience completely right in being put off by him. Hanson's defining physical feature is supposed to make him disgusting just as much as he makes it disgusting. Even Dwight, who should definitely know better than to judge someone who is so harshly judged by others for the way their body looks and works, refuses to take Hanson's hand as he is about to fall from a window. Dwight finds Hanson so appalling that he would rather choose the possibility of death than accept help from someone who looks like this. The reason I brought up the names of the actors playing these specific characters is because neither of them share their disabilities in real life, meaning that this is one among too many examples of able-bodied people being given the power to represent an already disadvantaged group in a vilifying manner. Scary Movie 2 aims to make you chuckle about horror films of old, and this sure is an old trope. The original Phantom of the Opera, House of Wax, even good old Texas Chainsaw Massacre are all guilty of perpetuating it. And once again, a Scary Movie film satirizes a trope which the movie itself is equally guilty of using. I haven't even mentioned how the film uses the exact same joke about Cindy sometimes looking like she has Down syndrome. Twice. Same lines, same punchline, same ableist crap. To actors like David Cross and Chris Elliott, these disabilities are mere costumes they can simply throw away after a day of work. This is literally what the equally ableist character of Doofy does by the end of the first film. Some people don't have that luxury. All they can do is live with the consequences of the people who stole their voices for the sake of mockery. My mind is fairly set about Hansen, but for the sake of making this analysis a little more diverse, let's look at how his inclusion can be interpreted as a positive. By turning the dial all the way to 11, as the Scary Movie franchise usually does, it's difficult to take such an outrageous character like this completely seriously. One could make the argument that Scary Movie 2 takes a stab at horror films which portray people with congenital anomalies like dangerous killers, by making Hansen not much more than a socially inept weirdo. When he eventually makes a proper heel turn by the third act, it's because he's possessed by one of the previous owners of the house. He becomes a villain because an able-bodied person, or rather ghost, literally takes control over his part in the narrative. I almost want to call this a straight-up genius metaphor. Almost. Hansen is a terrible character, but he is so terrible that you can't help but think about all the other horror films that came before Scary Movie 2 that used very similar characters with a completely straight face. At least Scary Movie 2 is fully aware of its own absurdity. Can we truly say the same about the type of horror film characters Hansen was based on? Hey, are you liking the video so far? Well, if you do, it would mean the world to me if you considered supporting Yhara, Zayd, and myself on our respective Patreon pages. My goal is being able to work on stuff like this full time, and if you became a patron right now, that could potentially become a reality someday. You also get exclusive benefits in return, of course. There are podcasts where I interview other content creators about some of their favorite pieces of horror media, vlogs and blog posts about what's going on behind the scenes, and you get access to my Discord server. I'm also on Ko-fi now, if you would prefer. Either way, supporting me, Yhara, or both would be pretty damn poggers of you. Do people still say poggers? For the third entry in the franchise, the Weinstein Company allegedly gave the Wayans brothers the boot without warning, the effects of which can be felt as soon as the film starts. The director's chair was given to David Zucker of Airplane and The Naked Gun fame, and his particular way of delivering jokes by non-stop bombardment results in a film that is way too busy delivering its next gag to make any meaningful points about the horror film genre. An eyebrow-raising amount of scenes don't bother with satirizing horror films at all, making it the most apparent precursor to what would eventually become a non-horror focused sub-series consisting of films like Date Movie, Epic Movie, and Disaster Movie, the last one being very appropriately titled. Only Cindy and Brenda are back for this one, and the main plot is once again based on more current horror films such as The Ring and Signs. Two films which, on a surface level, have little to no narrative or thematic synergy. If we're being generous, one could say that Scary Movie 3 makes a point by juxtaposing the decadent news network that Cindy works for with the killer videotape that ends the life of anyone who watches it within 7 days. Only these elements don't properly coalesce until the third act, when Cindy snatches a teleprompter to have a news anchor warn the public of the tape's existence. There are statements that could be made about people getting vicarious pleasure out of terrible real-life events that are continuously being broadcast on television, but Cindy's employers are more interested in sex than death. And it's not like there's a scene where members of the general public go, "A killer videotape? Sweet! Where can I rent it?" The main reason, if not the only reason, why Signs and The Ring were chosen as the foundation for Scary Movie 3 seems to have been their relevance in the pop cultural zeitgeist. And hey, having two very different films being badly Frankenstein together can be a joke all on its own, I guess. I genuinely struggle to find anything more to say about Scary Movie 3, at least in relation to the rest of this analysis. I'm not saying you can't read more into it. I guess I just can't find much else behind all those rapid attempts at comedic distractions. It was only when I started to think about how the film compares to its follow-up, Scary Movie 4, that something finally clicked. Scary Movie 4 is maybe the most unfocused of the bunch. It attempts to jump between the plots of War of the Worlds, The Village, The Grudge, and even Saw, all in a single film. The attempt is admirable, in a way. I sure couldn't make a film like that work. Or almost make that work. I wonder who wrote this one. Oh my god! Well, I guess this explains the scene where Joel tries to get out of Boston by lighting a firecracker in his ass. At first, I didn't have many thoughts on Scary Movie 4 either, but one particular scene caught my attention. In the subplot where Cindy deals with the spooks lurking around the Grudge house, she eventually gets the chance to talk to one of the ghosts face to face, and you know what? I'm just gonna play the scene for a bit.
Hibachi Benihana Teriyaki. Nagasaki, Okinawa, Hokkaido, Yokohama. Karate, judo, sumo, samurai.
Rewatching this, all these years later, was like having a lightning bolt pierce through my brain. Suddenly, I realized something. Something I should have realized way sooner. Remakes of non-English speaking horror films, specifically those based on films by people who aren't white, are actually kind of racist. And it goes beyond simply replacing, say, Asian actors with Americans. It's not the kind of racism that's overtly hateful towards different cultures, but the kind that simply doesn't care about them, that doesn't respect them, or their culture. Cindy and the Ghost Boy are just throwing around incoherent Japanese words and brand names. And the joke is that, from a prejudiced movie exec's perspective, there's no difference between the Japanese language and absolute nonsense. And clearly they believe their audience to feel the same. This subplot doesn't take its inspiration from the original Ju-on, but the American remake, and it too whitewashed its main cast. It still takes place in Japan, but curiously enough, all of the characters that really matter, apart from the vengeful spirits, are played by white people. The 2022 reboot did even worse in this regard, by literally moving the titular curse to the United States. Which I guess makes it a rather fitting allegory for American remakes as a whole. And yeah, I know the real reason why these films were remade was because American studios saw some films that did really well abroad and figured they could make an easy buck for themselves off of the name recognition. That doesn't make the racist aspect any less true though. Just as the fact that it was the director of Ju-on who directed the remake doesn't negate the whitewashing. It actually highlights the aforementioned apathy towards everything that isn't the recognizable title. While Scary Movie 3 doesn't have a scene that is as explicitly racist towards Asian people as the one in Scary Movie 4, it still shows signs of the same issue. Wait, did I just make a pun? To no one's surprise, the main players in the Ring subplot are white, including this version of the villain, Sadako. More importantly though, it scrubs the plot clean of everything which makes it culturally significant to its country of origin. I don't doubt that some American author could have come up with the concept of a woman crawling out of a TV to murder people, but like Ju-on, Ring or Ringu isn't Japanese simply because of its setting. The way the story is told is inherently Japanese. Everything from how Sadako is visually designed, to the significance of the well which creates the titular ring, stems from Japanese folklore. Maybe most of all from the legend of Okiku and the well at Himeji Castle. Even the fact that Okiku comes back from the well where she died to count the 9 plates of her master, one of the last things she did before the murder, could be compared to how Sadako counts down to the 7th day before she takes the life of her victim. I'm not by any means saying that you can't take stories like this and explore them through the lens of different cultures, but by transplanting elements directly without regard to cultural context, you will inevitably rob the creators of their unique expression. Sadako used to be a sympathetic character, who turned into a monster because of how the world abused her. In Scary Movie 3, she's a murderous jester, who by the 3rd act is doing a Leatherface impersonation. She's almost completely unrecognizable, and so the original meaning of her character is lost. The artistic crimes made by Scary Movie 3 and 4 in this regard aren't worse than the ones committed by the remakes they parody, because they are ultimately the same. There is this quote by the director of the first Ring film, Hideo Nakata, which makes this realization all the more sad to me.
I firmly believe a very Japanese film that is different from others can easily cross borders.
I want to believe that as well. It's just a shame that not enough people with the power to further distribute those films seem to agree. However, credit where credit is due. Putting Dr. Phil in a saw trap was pretty based.
That's my birth tuba.
After a 7-year gap, the longest the franchise has ever seen, Scary Movie returned in 2013 with what is currently its final installment. Interestingly, this is the first time since the short spoof of the Blair Witch Project in the first film that a Scary Movie entry has tackled the topic of found footage horror. This time the plot is based on the 2007 smash hit Paranormal Activity, which arguably made Scary Movie 5 outdated on arrival. However, I do think it adds to an underlying message of this film. Okay, so technically Paranormal Activity did release in 2007, but it didn't get a wide release until 2009. Not to mention all the sequels, which kept it relevant during the early 2010s. Although, as you will see, this doesn't necessarily detract from the point I'm about to make. The main draw of found footage horror is its ability to present a sense of an authentic reality, to portray a narrative in such a way that it looks like it actually happened. The camera is often handheld by one or several of the characters, and the visual fidelity tends to be on the lower side, in order to achieve an unpolished and homemade look. Although we have now reached a point where even phone cameras can capture footage at 4K resolution, the cinematography skills of those holding the cameras, or the lack thereof, still help to make even modern found footage horror feel grounded. Scary Movie 5 has both handheld and rigged cameras, which the protagonists use to try and figure out the mystery of their new house. This mode of storytelling is, in this case, completely superfluous. The cameras used when the film wants to go for the found footage aesthetic are exactly the same as the high-end ones that are supposed to be non-diegetic. The fact that there are so many instances of non-diegetic cameras at all ruins the immersion that found footage horror is so good at providing. When Scary Movie 5 does commit to the aesthetic, it does so in a hilariously half-assed way. Which is a funny joke, if it was intended to be one. All the film does is slap a static rec symbol in the bottom right corner of the frame, or the occasional timestamps. There are TikTok filters more convincing than this. What makes this choice all the more baffling is that you can clearly see the relatively cheaper cameras held by the characters in between shots, which coincidentally look almost exactly like the one I use. It's truly ironic that the solution to this whole aesthetic problem is literally in the palm of the character's hands. That Scary Movie 5 was made so long after both its prequel and the film it primarily aimed to parody mirrors instances of Hollywood and the film industry as a whole, taking pieces of horror media long after their peak popularity has passed and reimagining them without keeping the things that made them effective in the first place. The 2018 film adaptation of Slender Man is a good example. What was originally a compelling piece of internet creepypasta got turned into a highly unimaginative psychological monster flick. The Slender Man character is not very scary on his own. He's nothing but a tall man in a suit. What made him scary, or at the very least interesting, was the implication of him. That the photos and written stories about him could be real. Actually seeing the slender boy in motion in a packed movie theater could never create that sense of uncertainty, because he's right there, in all his movie makeup and CGI goodness. As said by Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. The original Paranormal Activity was a $15,000 indie film, shot in the director's own house. While the sequels lessened the story's sense of authenticity, at least the cheap found footage aesthetic was somewhat retained. However, even the Paranormal Activity series would eventually fail the intended vision of the first film, with the 2021 release of Next of Kin, which occasionally looks just as slick and color-corrected as Scary Movie 5, making it almost prophetic in a way. It is funny how the film highlights the absurdity of some found footage films, having characters carrying around cameras in situations where it's questionable that anyone would. At one point, Dan brings his camera into the kitchen while looking for his girlfriend in the middle of the night, simply because that's expected of a found footage protagonist to do. They carry their cameras everywhere. They bring them to school, to work, into the woods. Their cameras occupy the bed space where a pet would normally sleep. The difference here is that we don't see it from his perspective, but from the mounted cameras on the ceiling. Look at that silly guy, walking around with a camera in his pajamas. Now that's comedy. The greatest shame of Scary Movie 5, however, is that 13 years after the first, the franchise still subjected its audience to gags containing queer-coded creeps.
Yes, it was a difficult decision, but I have always been attracted to Jodie. How could I not? She has the body of a fifth-grade boy.
And body shaming.
Let's get you in a robe.
You'd think that some lessons would have been learned with over a decade of learning possibilities. Nope. The Scary Movie franchise seems to be perpetually stuck in its early 2000s mentality, which perhaps makes it unsurprising that we haven't seen a follow-up to Scary Movie 5 in the last 10 years. Clearly, we've all grown past this franchise and all that it stands for. Well, to recap, Scary Movie gives us prime examples of how women and queer people have been severely mistreated in horror cinema, as well as some examples of how to do things right. Scary Movie 2 points out the reoccurring use of ableist caricatures of people with various disabilities and congenital anomalies that have been around since the very conception of horror films. Scary Movie 3 and 4 expose the underlying racism of appropriating and remaking non-English speaking horror films to an audience that supposedly will find it easier to care if the characters don't speak in a language that, to them, might as well be complete gibberish. And finally, Scary Movie 5 is a reminder of how Hollywood often attempts to translate pieces of obscure horror media, which are uniquely effective because of their original unpolished form, only to render them pointless and trite on the big screen. However, the most important point of all is that all of these sentiments are still relevant. Depictions of queer-coded people as villains? It's such an ingrained trope that you likely didn't even notice it while watching The Black Phone. Hurtful portrayals of ableist caricatures? How about a double bill of Barbarian and Midsommar? Remakes that severely undermine the cultural significance of the original works? I hear that the train to Busan is taking a detour through New York this year. Adaptations that completely lose their flair through the Hollywood machine? I hope you're hyped for a visit to the back rooms at your local movie theater. When we look at horror films from the past, some of them depicts things in a way that just comes off as silly. Reefer Madness, a film about a group of adolescents losing their minds due to excessive use of marijuana, depicted something that was genuinely dread-inducing at the time. But we know better now, to the point that there was even a musical parody made of the film, which is freaking great, by the way. It would have been nice to look back on Scary Movie in a similar way. Do you remember when people thought that congenital anomalies like having one smaller hand was disgusting and worthy of mockery? Thank God we don't see crap like that anymore. But we do. And as long as we keep seeing it, the way the Scary Movie franchise parody horror films will be as relevant as ever. That's a pretty sour note to end on, though. Let's not forget that this franchise marked a pretty significant point in black horror cinema, as pointed out by Yhara Zayd. Not only was it a huge financial success spearheaded by black creatives, it was a successful franchise that, at least at first, criticized and parodied popular horror films from a uniquely black perspective. Not until comedian turned director Jordan Peele made his debut with Get Out almost 2 decades later, would a horror film with that same perspective make a similarly large impact on popular culture. Scary Movie, in comparison, is not a serious franchise. In fact, it might be deadly allergic to the word. But it's worth considering that these films might have had some serious points as well. Art doesn't need to be smart to say something meaningful about the world we live in. And even though it might be a tough pill to swallow for some, Scary Movie and its sequels are in fact pieces of art. What we can ultimately learn from them might have more to do with their bad qualities than their good ones, but one has to remember that they were made as a response to what was already present in the genre at the time. To call out what's bad about Scary Movie is to call out what's bad about the horror genre as a whole. It frankly doesn't matter if some or even all of the observations I've made in this analysis were intentional attempts at commentary from the filmmakers, because the fact that the comparisons to the problematic side of today's horror films are so easy to make speaks volumes. I may not like the Scary Movie franchise. I'd much rather watch individual funny clips than go through the films from beginning to end. What I can't deny, though, is that they are deeply interesting. And you know what? sometimes that's enough. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to my very patient patrons who've been waiting for this video since fall of 2022. Here are some of their names. Anaday, Callum Wally, Eben Phantom, Frans Johannes Foilner, Håvard Krugerud, Infernal Ramblings, Jack Lightfoot, Jesse Earl, L. Tantivy, Lesser Sage of Stars, Martha C., Mackenzie Pollock, Nichtschwert, Nick Owens, Noah Fryman, Professor Flowers, Seth Sard, Silkmoth, TB Skyen, Yuli Troyo, and Vinders. I also want to thank Phil Keeling for providing his voice, David J. Bradley, Mira Cox, and Pixel a Day for proofreading the script, and most of all, I want to thank Yhara Zayd. I asked her for a quote, and she basically delivered a whole separate video's worth of material. I am beyond grateful to her for making this video way, and I mean way better. You'll find all of their links in the description. Well, if you're still here, maybe you could tell me about some horror parodies that you really like down in the comments. I think my favorite is Young Frankenstein. If you haven't watched that one, congratulations! You still have the chance to watch one of the best films ever made for the first time.